Lena was sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee slowly cooling beside her when she first noticed it. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A friend had tagged her in a post on social media. She picked it up, wiping her hands on the kitchen towel, curious as to why her friend was reaching out to her at this hour. But when she opened the notification, the picture that appeared on her screen froze her in place. It was a photo of her parents, standing in front of what was supposed to be their new home. They were smiling widely, holding glasses of champagne as they posed with a small group of friends. Behind them, the modern sprawling house stood with large glass windows that reflected the golden afternoon sun, the kind of house that looked like something from a real estate ad, the house she had bought for them. Lena stared at the photo, her heart suddenly racing. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when her parents would settle into their new home, the place she had spent the better part of the last year purchasing for them. When they'd called her to tell her they'd found the perfect place and that they were ready to move, Lena had been overjoyed. It wasn't that she hadn't been able to afford it. She had more than enough savings. It was that, for years, her parents had sacrificed so much to ensure she had everything she needed. She had always felt guilty for being the child who had the opportunities they never did, and this house was meant to be her way of repaying them. It had been months since the closing of the deal. They had been so grateful, always reminding her how much this home meant to them, how they would take good care of it. Lena had even visited the house a few times after they'd moved in, helping with some minor renovations and offering advice on furniture. The house was supposed to be a symbol of their future, their security, and her generosity. But now, as she stared at the photo, something felt wrong. Her stomach dropped. The photo was a housewarming party, clearly larger than a few close family members. The yard was full of guests, all laughing and talking, and her parents were at the center of it all, basking in the joy of a new life. But she wasn't there. She wasn't invited. She scrolled through the comments below the post. There were dozens of them. "This house is stunning," one person wrote. "So happy for you," another comment read. "Thank you so much for having us. It was such a beautiful evening," someone else said. But nowhere did she see a mention of her. Not a single person had tagged her. No one had even acknowledged that Lena had been involved in any way. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed a quick message to her mother. But after a few moments of hesitation, she decided to call instead. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe they hadn't realized that she would have wanted to be there. But when her mother picked up the phone, her voice sounded cheerful? Almost too cheerful? "Hi, sweetie, how are you?" "Mom," Lena said, trying to keep her tone steady. "I just saw the photos from the party. What's going on? Why wasn't I invited?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, honey, it wasn't a big thing. Just a few friends from the neighborhood. You know, we wanted to keep it small." Lena's chest tightened. She could hear the tension in her mother's voice. "A small party?" she repeated, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "It looks like it was a pretty big party from the photos, and no one even mentioned me. I thought you'd at least let me know. I mean, I bought that house for you." There was another long pause, and Lena could almost hear her mother scrambling for the right words. Finally, her mother spoke, but her tone had shifted. "Sweetie, I know you bought it for us, and we're so grateful. You don't know how much this means to us, but honestly, we didn't want to make it awkward. We didn't think it would be right to have you there." "Make it awkward?" Lena repeated, the disbelief growing in her voice. "What are you talking about?" Her mother's voice softened. "It's just that we've been trying to settle in and, well, we wanted to enjoy the house without worrying about any complications. It's hard to explain, but we thought it would be easier this way. You know how things can be sometimes." Lena felt the words sting more than they should have. She had spent months working out the details for their new home, making sure everything was perfect, and now it felt as though her contribution didn't even matter. She had given them the keys to their future, yet here they were, acting as if she were an outsider, a person who could be left out of such an important moment in their lives. "You really didn't want me there?" Lena's voice cracked despite her attempts to stay calm. "Mom, I gave you this house. It's not like I'm some distant relative who's never part of the family. You didn't even think to tell me about the party?" Her mother's response was quick, defensive. "It wasn't personal, Lena. I didn't mean to hurt you, but it's just, well, we wanted to have it our way." Lena blinked, her mind reeling. Her mother had always been careful with her feelings. Her father, though less vocal, had always shown gratitude, albeit in his own quiet way. They had always told her how much they appreciated everything she did for them, how she was the reason they could retire early and live comfortably. But now it seemed like they were pushing her away, perhaps because they didn't want to acknowledge the financial help she had given them, or maybe because they were trying to create a version of their life that didn't involve her. Her voice was now steady, though her heart pounded. "I don't understand why you'd do this. I'm not just some ATM for you, I'm your daughter. And I thought we were close. I thought you'd want me there, celebrating with you." "I'm sorry, Lena," her mother said, her tone apologetic but distant. "I didn't mean to hurt you. Let's just forget this happened, okay?" But Lena couldn't forget it. She had already replayed the conversation in her head a dozen times, but the sting of her mother's words remained. She couldn't erase the feeling that something had shifted, that they no longer saw her as a family member but as a benefactor. She had been part of their lives, their home, their future, but in that moment, she felt like an outsider, a stranger. Lena ended the call without saying much more. She didn't know how to express the hurt she felt, and she didn't trust herself not to say something she'd regret. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise still room. She sat there for a long time, staring at the photo on her phone. The housewarming party was still fresh in her mind, its images mocking her. Her parents had never outright asked for the house. She had offered, of course, but they had accepted without hesitation, almost too eagerly, as if the house was the answer to all their dreams. And it had been, in a way. It had been everything they had wanted. A fresh start, a place to enjoy their retirement years. But now it felt like a transaction. A one-sided favor with no room for her, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices she had made to make it happen. It was a harsh realization, but one Lena couldn't ignore. She had given them everything, and they had chosen to take it for granted. And worse still, they had excluded her from something so fundamentally important to her, a housewarming party that should have celebrated not just their new life, but the fact that they were able to live it because of her. Lena set the phone down and stared at it for a long time. She could feel the tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall, not yet. She wasn't ready to deal with what had happened, not yet. But one thing was for sure, nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Lena's discovery felt like an endless cycle of tension, a sharp weight pressing against her chest every time she thought about the party. Her mind kept returning to the same questions. Why hadn't they invited her? Why hadn't they acknowledged her role in the new house? Were they ashamed of her help? Was this their way of distancing themselves from her? Despite the turmoil swirling inside her, she kept it together on the surface. She focused on work, buried herself in the stacks of legal paperwork that seemed endless, trying to forget the betrayal that gnawed at her. But each evening when she stepped through the door of her apartment, the hollow feeling would come rushing back. The thought of her parents, hosting their friends and neighbors, celebrating their new home without her, without even a mention of her contribution, was almost unbearable. Finally, after days of avoiding the inevitable, Lena decided that she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to confront them. She couldn't just sit in the silence of her confusion and hurt any longer. There was no way to move forward without addressing it head-on. It was Saturday morning when she made the call. The idea of visiting them made her feel like she was walking straight into a minefield, but she had no choice. She couldn't let this fester inside her forever. Her mother picked up after the first ring, as she always did. Her voice sounded cheery, almost too cheery, and Lena could already tell that her mother was pretending everything was fine, but Lena wasn't fooled. "Hi, sweetie, how's your weekend going?" "I need to talk to you," Lena said, her voice steady though it betrayed none of the tumult inside her. "About the party." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Lena could almost hear her mother trying to process what she was saying, scrambling for a response. After a long, uncomfortable pause, her mother sighed. "Oh, Lena, I thought we had moved past that. It wasn't meant to hurt you, you know that." I don't know that, Lena shot back, her tone colder than she intended. I don't know anything right now. I saw the photos, Mom. I wasn't invited. No one even mentioned me. Not a single person on your post acknowledged I had any part in the house. Why? Her mother's voice faltered, as if she hadn't expected Lena to confront her so directly. We didn't want to make it complicated. You know how things can get when you're all together. We just wanted to have a simple, peaceful evening with our friends. Lena clenched her jaw, trying to suppress the anger that bubbled up inside her. A simple evening? Mom, I bought that house for you. I worked hard for it, and you didn't think it was important to have me there, celebrating with you? There was a long pause on the line, so long that Lena felt the silence press against her like a suffocating blanket. Her mother's voice, when it finally returned, was softer, but Lena could hear the defensive edge in it. It wasn't about you, sweetie. It wasn't about the house or what you did for us. We were just trying to create our own space, to make it feel like ours. We didn't want anyone feeling awkward, and we thought it would be easier this way. Easier? Lena echoed, her pulse racing. She could feel the tension building, the anger threatening to boil over. You thought it would be easier to pretend I didn't exist? To pretend like I wasn't part of the reason you have this house in the first place? You know, it doesn't feel like just a gift anymore. It feels like a transaction. Like you've accepted this thing from me and now you want nothing to do with me. Like I'm some sort of outsider. Her mother's voice became quieter, more careful. That's not what we meant, Lena. You're not an outsider, but we didn't want you to feel uncomfortable. We didn't want to remind you that we can't repay you for what you did. We know you've done a lot for us, but sometimes it feels like we owe you too much. The words hit Lena harder than she expected. She knew her parents were grateful, but she had never thought of their gratitude as something that would make them feel like they owed her. It was never supposed to feel like a debt. It was meant to feel like a gift, an act of love. But now, hearing those words, Lena realized the situation was more complicated than she had understood. They weren't just pushing her away, they were hiding behind their guilt. They didn't want to acknowledge the imbalance that existed between them, the fact that they relied on her, not just emotionally but financially, and that uncomfortable truth seemed to have created a chasm between them. Lena tried to steady herself, but the hurt was impossible to suppress. Mom, I didn't do this because I expected something in return. I did it because I wanted to give you both something to enjoy, something that would make your lives easier. But now it feels like you've rejected me. Like you don't want anything to do with me when it matters most. I'm so sorry, Lena, her mother said, her voice small, barely audible. I really didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Please. Understand, this was never about not wanting you there. It's just that sometimes we feel like we're intruding on your life, and it feels like we're just taking from you all the time. Lena's mind was reeling. Her mother's apology sounded sincere, but it didn't take away the sting. It didn't undo the hurt she had felt when she saw that photo, when she realized that her parents had gone ahead with their celebration without her. It didn't undo the sense of isolation that had washed over her. The feeling of being pushed aside. She could feel tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wasn't about to cry, not now, not like this. She needed answers, not sympathy. I don't know what to say, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I've given so much to you, and now I'm not even a part of your life when it matters. I'm just supposed to stay in the background and be grateful? I don't want to be a stranger in my own family. There was a long silence. Lena could almost hear her mother's thoughts on the other end of the line, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, her mother spoke. I don't know how to fix this, Lena, but I'll try. I swear I'll try to make things right. Lena took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. I don't know if it's something you can fix. It feels like you've already made your choice. You've pushed me away, and now you're pretending like nothing's wrong. Her mother's voice cracked. I never meant for it to feel like that. I never wanted to make you feel unimportant. Then why didn't you invite me? Lena asked, her words sharp but vulnerable. Why didn't you want me there? There was no immediate answer, only the soft sound of her mother's breathing. And in that moment, Lena realized something she hadn't considered before. Her parents had never known how to handle her generosity, how to bridge the gap between giving and receiving. They had never been comfortable with the idea that Lena had more than they did, that she had reached a point where she could provide for them, and that discomfort had pushed them into a place of avoidance. "I'm coming over tomorrow," Lena said, her decision sudden but clear. "We need to talk more, face to face. I can't keep doing this over the phone." Her mother hesitated, but Lena didn't give her a chance to respond. "I'll be there in the afternoon. We'll figure this out then." "Okay," her mother finally replied, her voice small, almost resigned. "I'll be here. I'm sorry, Lena. I really am." Lena hung up the phone without saying another word. The silence in her apartment felt heavy now, each moment filled with the weight of everything she had just heard. She couldn't believe how complicated things had gotten. She couldn't believe that a simple gesture of generosity had turned into something so much more painful. But deep down, Lena knew this conversation had been inevitable. She had been avoiding the truth for too long, and now, face to face with it, she had to decide whether to repair the rift or walk away. The choice wasn't clear yet, but Lena knew that tomorrow would bring more answers. And with it, the chance to finally face what had been left unsaid for too long. The drive to her parents' house the next afternoon felt longer than it should have. Lena sat behind the wheel, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the familiar streets passed by in a blur. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft, golden hue over everything. But Lena barely noticed the beauty of the day. Her mind was racing, replaying the conversation she had had with her mother just hours before. The pain in her chest hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier, more suffocating as she tried to come to terms with what had happened. What hurt the most was the realization that her parents, people she had always believed were her strongest supporters, the ones who had encouraged her every step of the way, had never fully understood her. They had never understood how much she gave, how much she sacrificed, just to see them happy. They had accepted her gifts, her financial support, her time, her efforts, but they had never truly seen the emotional cost attached to it. They hadn't understood that their actions, or lack thereof, had consequences, and now she was left feeling like an outsider in her own family, like the very people who should have had her back were the ones pushing her away. Lena pulled into her parents' driveway, the house standing before her like a monument to all the things that had gone wrong. It was beautiful, no doubt about that. The large windows, the sleek design, the well-kept garden. It was everything her parents had dreamed of. And it had all been made possible because of her. But the reality of it felt different now. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of everything that had shifted between them. The housewarming party was just the beginning. What followed was a realization that the line between family and financial obligation had become blurred beyond recognition. She sat in the car for a few moments, breathing deeply, trying to gather the strength to face them. The last thing she wanted to do was argue, but she knew that there was no way around it. The truth needed to come out. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that the cracks in their relationship didn't matter. The facade of polite indifference, the awkward silences had been building for months. The housewarming party had merely been the tipping point. But Lena wasn't sure how to fix things. She wasn't sure if they could be fixed at all. With a sigh, she opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cool air on her face. Her parents' house stood in front of her, quiet and still, like it was waiting. She walked up the path, each step bringing her closer to the uncomfortable conversation that awaited her. The front door opened before she could knock, and her mother appeared, looking both relieved and nervous. "Lena, sweetheart," her mother said, stepping aside to let her in. "I'm so glad you're here. We've been waiting for you." Lena nodded, forcing a smile. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual warmth. She couldn't bring herself to pretend. Not anymore. Her mother led her into the living room where her father was sitting on the couch reading a newspaper. He looked up when Lena entered, his face softening slightly in greeting. But there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that things were different now, that everything had shifted and not in a good way. "Hi, honey," her father said, setting the newspaper aside and standing to greet her. "We've been meaning to talk to you about all this. I know things have been a little tense lately." Lena didn't sit down. She couldn't. She felt too restless, too unsettled. The emotions swirling inside her needed to be released, but she didn't know where to begin. So much had built up over the past few days, weeks even. She wanted answers, but she wasn't sure what kind of answers she was hoping for. "Yeah," Lena said, her voice tight. "I think we need to talk. About the party. About everything, actually." Her mother's face flushed slightly, and she exchanged a quick glance with her father before returning her gaze to Lena. "We didn't want to hurt you, sweetheart. We really didn't. Things got out of hand." Out of hand? Lena felt a bitter laugh rising in her throat. How could things get out of hand when the situation had been so clear from the beginning? She had given them everything she had, and this was how they repaid her? By distancing themselves, by treating her like a stranger in her own home. She could feel the frustration building in her chest, but she kept it in check. For now. "I don't understand," Lena said, the words coming out more sharply than she had intended. "I don't understand how you could do this. I mean, I gave you this house, this life, and you just left me out. As if I'm not a part of it, as if I don't matter." Her father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Lena, we're grateful for everything you've done. We've always been grateful. You know that, right?" "I thought I did," Lena said bitterly. "But if you were really grateful, you would have treated me like I mattered. You would have invited me to the party. You would have acknowledged the fact that I was the reason you even had a house to celebrate in the first place." Her mother looked at her father, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and confusion. "We never meant to make you feel excluded. I don't know, it's hard to explain. We've always tried to make you proud, Lena. We've always tried to do things on our own, but with the house, it just felt different. It felt like too much to ask for you to be there. We didn't want to put you in a position where you felt like we were leaning on you too much." "Leaning on me?" Lena's voice rose in disbelief. "That's what this is about? You didn't invite me because you didn't want to lean on me too much? I'm your daughter, not some distant relative. I'm not just here to hand you money and disappear. I'm supposed to be part of your life, part of your family." Her father's eyes softened and he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "We know, Lena, we know. And we're sorry for making you feel like this. But you have to understand, it's not easy for us to accept help, especially when it comes from you. We've always been the ones who took care of you. Now it feels like the roles have reversed, and we don't know how to handle it." Lena was silent for a moment, taking in her father's words. She had never thought about it that way. For so long, she had been the one who had everything: career success, financial stability, and her parents had always been the ones to help her when she was struggling, to offer emotional support when life felt overwhelming. But now, the roles had shifted, and it seemed like her parents were struggling with the idea of her being the provider. They hadn't known how to accept that, and in their discomfort, they had pushed her away. "I didn't want to make you feel like you owe me anything," Lena said quietly, her anger fading into something else, something more akin to sadness. "But you have to realize that I didn't do it for anything in return. I did it because I love you both, and I wanted you to have something good. I wanted you to be happy." Her mother reached out and took her hand. "We know, Lena, and we love you for it, but we didn't want to make it harder for you. We didn't want you to feel like we were taking advantage of you. That's why we did what we did, but we see now that we've hurt you, and that was never our intention." Lena felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. She had come here expecting to be angry, expecting to lash out and demand answers, but hearing her parents' side of things, hearing their vulnerability, opened up something inside her that she hadn't been expecting. They weren't rejecting her. They were rejecting the idea of being dependent on her. They were struggling with the weight of what she had given them, and in their fear of being seen as burdens, they had unintentionally shut her out. "I just want to feel like I belong here," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm not just some source of money to you. Like I'm actually part of your family." "You are part of our family," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we'll do whatever it takes to show you that. We're sorry, Lena. Truly sorry." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence hung heavy in the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a quiet kind of understanding, the kind that comes after the storm has passed. Lena knew that the road ahead would still be rocky, that there were still things they needed to work through. But for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Her parents weren't perfect, and neither was their relationship with her, but they were trying, and for now, that was enough. The following days after the conversation with her parents were a mix of relief and uncertainty. Lena could feel the weight of the discussion lingering, but it was no longer the crushing weight of betrayal. The truth had been spoken, the lines had been drawn, and both sides had finally been heard. In many ways, the confrontation had opened up a new chapter for their relationship, but it was only the beginning, and Lena knew that there was a long road ahead before everything could be fully healed. The first step, she realized, was in giving herself the space to process everything that had transpired. She had always been the kind of person who pushed through emotions, burying them under layers of responsibility, ambition, and distractions. It was easier that way, harder to confront the mess of feelings that came with vulnerability. But now, after everything had been laid bare, Lena found herself more introspective than she had been in years. She had spent so much of her life making decisions for others, trying to make her parents proud, trying to fix things that weren't even broken, that she had forgotten to ask herself if she was doing it for the right reasons. In the days following the confrontation, Lena spent more time reflecting on her own life, on the things that had been weighing her down, on the relationships she had neglected, and on the expectations she had placed on herself. She had always been the responsible one, the one who made sure everyone else was taken care of. It had become her identity, almost like a shield against her own vulnerability. But now she was beginning to see that she had allowed herself to lose sight of what really mattered in the process, her own happiness, her own sense of self. It was Thursday evening when Lena decided to go for a walk. The cool evening air felt refreshing against her skin, and she welcomed the solitude. The streets were quieter than usual, the hum of the city fading into the background as she moved through the familiar neighborhood. It was the kind of evening where thoughts could settle, and Lena was ready to let her mind wander. She needed to make sense of everything, to figure out where to go from here. As she walked, she thought about her parents. The conversation they had been difficult, but there had been something in her mother's voice, something in her father's eyes, that told Lena they had truly understood the depth of her feelings. They had apologized, but it wasn't just a simple apology. It was a recognition of their own shortcomings, a realization that their actions had been shaped by guilt and fear, not malice, and that, in itself, was a breakthrough. Lena couldn't deny the relief she felt after that conversation. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It was about understanding and mutual respect. The rift between them hadn't just been created by the house. It had been growing long before that, fueled by misunderstandings and unspoken expectations. But now, they were taking the first steps toward healing. It was up to her, too, to do the same. When Lena returned home that evening, she found a message from her mother on her phone. It was short, but it carried a weight that made her smile. "Lena, we've been thinking a lot about everything we talked about. We don't want to keep making the same mistakes. Let's start fresh. We love you. Always." It wasn't perfect. There was still so much to talk about, so much to work through. But it was a start. It was an olive branch extended, a quiet promise that they would try harder. Lena read the message again, then put her phone down, letting out a deep breath. She knew that the road ahead would be complicated. There would be moments of tension, moments of doubt, and moments when they would all falter. But for the first time in a long time, Lena felt a sense of hope. They were trying. And so was she. The weekend passed in a haze of quiet reflection. Lena spent time with her parents, the air between them less strained, but still marked by the heaviness of what had happened. They didn't have all the answers, and they certainly didn't have all the solutions, but they were willing to face it together. It was a slow process, but it was progress. On Sunday, Lena decided to visit the house. It had been several days since she had seen it, and she had been avoiding it since the party. She had wanted to put distance between herself and the place that had become a symbol of her emotional struggle. But now she needed to go back, not to reclaim something or to prove a point, but to move forward. Her parents were at home when she arrived, and as she stepped inside, she was greeted with the familiar, comforting warmth of the house. It was a beautiful place, no doubt about that, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply enjoy its presence. There was no tension in the air, no unresolved feelings hanging over them. It felt like a place where healing could begin. Her mother was in the kitchen preparing lunch. When Lena entered, she turned and smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting a quiet kind of understanding. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm glad you came." Lena smiled back, though it was bittersweet. She still wasn't sure what to make of everything, but she knew that she needed to be here. She needed to show her parents that she wasn't going to let the past define their future. She wasn't going to let this house, this complicated gift, be a source of pain anymore. "I was thinking," Lena said as she leaned against the counter, watching her mother work, "maybe we could have a real celebration. Not a big party, but just a simple dinner. A chance to celebrate the fact that we're all here, together, and moving forward." Her mother's face softened, and for the first time in days, Lena felt the tension between them ease. "That sounds perfect," her mother said, her voice filled with a genuine warmth that made Lena's heart ache in the best way. "We'd love that. We really would." Later that evening, as the three of them sat down to dinner, just her mother, and her father, Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. It wasn't a perfect dinner. There were still things left unsaid, still moments where the discomfort of the past lingered in the air. But there was also laughter. There was love. There was a sense of connection that had been missing for far too long. They didn't talk about the housewarming party. They didn't talk about the past. Instead, they focused on the present, on the simple joy of being together. And that, Lena realized, was enough. It wasn't about the house or the things she had given them. It was about the fact that they were still a family. It was about the understanding that no matter what had happened, they were willing to try again. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Lena didn't expect everything to be fixed immediately, but the efforts were there. Her parents reached out more, made an effort to spend time with her, and they began to rebuild the trust that had been fractured. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and sometimes, real was all they could ask for. Lena, too, learned to let go of the expectations that had weighed so heavily on her. She learned that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about doing everything for others or sacrificing herself at every turn. It was about balance. It was about being there for each other, but also being there for herself. She began to take more time for the things that made her happy, the things that made her feel whole again. It wasn't selfish, it was necessary, and in doing so, she found a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. And as for the house, it became a place where new memories were made. Not just memories of sacrifice and tension, but memories of connection, of laughter, and of love. The house, once a symbol of what had been broken, slowly began to feel like a home once more. In the end, Lena learned that family wasn't about what you gave or what you received. It wasn't about grand gestures or gestures of guilt. It was about understanding each other, about accepting each other's flaws, and about showing up, even when things got hard. And most importantly, it was about choosing to move forward together, with love as the foundation.